25 years ago, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace hit theaters, introducing audiences to a new chapter of the Star Wars universe. It was released after years of monumental hype over the long-awaited return of Star Wars, and predictably enough, it did not live up to that hype. The film was critically panned and spent the next decade and a half as most people's pick for the worst Star Wars film, which only changed when the sequels were released and became the fanbase's new favorite punching bag. Since the release of the sequels, The Phantom Menace and the rest of the prequel trilogy have been re-evaluated in a much more favorable light. Those of us who grew up with and loved the prequels from the outset have become a more vocal part of the fanbase in recent years, and as a result, the trilogy is finally getting the credit it had always deserved. As a result, as what was once the most hated Star Wars film reaches its 25th anniversary, many people are looking back on it fondly, so we thought we'd throw in our 2 cents about Episode 1, why we love it so much, what people miss about its plot and themes, and why it's always been the most underrated Star Wars movie.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Phantom Menace was a story that George Lucas had always wanted to tell. The rough story of the prequels had been sketched out before even the release of A New Hope, and while the nature of the Star Wars saga evolved as the films of the original trilogy were developed, the core of the prequel story stayed the same. Lucas put telling that story off because he believed that the filmmaking technology of the time was insufficient to convey his vision of the core worlds and the Republic at its height, so he started the Star Wars saga in the middle. And he only set about making the prequel trilogy when the CGI in Jurassic Park convinced him that the needed VFX technology had finally arrived. The prequel trilogy, in its final form, was closely in line with what Lucas's vision had been from the beginning, and it was much different from the Star Wars that people were used to. The original trilogy was built on a classic mythological framework, telling the story of plucky underdog heroes from the fringe of the galaxy fighting a rebellion against an evil empire. A tale of good and evil that combined myth and political allegory. The prequel trilogy, meanwhile, was a subversion of those same classical frameworks, showing us the rots at a civilization's heart, the fall of democracy and once noble orders and ideals, and the blurred line between heroes and villains, with the political messaging much more in your face and many of the trappings of myth discarded. We would argue that this subversion of expectations and of what people understood Star Wars to be was a big part of why the prequels were so hated, and a big part of what makes them so great. And even while the prequels stand in sharp contrast to the originals, there's also plenty of symmetry between the two trilogies, and they ultimately tell 2 halves of the same story, each essential to understanding the other. The originals are about revolution against the Empire. The prequels show us how empires are made. The original trilogy shows us the struggle of those living on the fringe of the galaxy. The prequel shows us the rot at the galaxy's heart that creates such conditions. The originals are about noble heroes fighting against evil. The prequels show us that both the heroes and the villains aren't always who we thought they were. They complement each other, and they're meant to make up one cohesive whole. So, as we discuss The Phantom Menace, we're going to be looking at it as George Lucas intended it, as a piece of a greater whole, just the beginning of the legend. We're going to start by taking a look at the big picture, at the way the film builds its world. We've said before that good world building is one of the most essential components of good Star Wars projects, and The Phantom Menace is a particularly stellar example of Star Wars' world building in action. World building could even be considered the main focus of Episode 1. After all, much of the film is spent setting up the universe, the characters, the crises facing the Republic, and the plot threads the later movies draw upon. It does a lot of this world building visually. Visually, The Phantom Menace is one of the most unique Star Wars films, full of color and life, and a lot of uniqueness comes from how it subverts a lot of the aesthetics of the original trilogy. A very important aspect of the original trilogy's visuals was what the artists at Lucasfilm call the used universe aesthetic. Everything looks battered and worn out, from the ships to the locations and even the characters. In contrast to the sleek, shiny spaceships science fiction was once saturated with, The ships of the original trilogy are blocky, covered in greebles, and weathered, with our hero ships in particular looking like they've seen better days. All of this not only gives the Star Wars universe a very grounded feel, but it also establishes that this is a world with history. It's not just the ships that have seen better days, the galaxy has as well. But the Phantom Menace is meant to show us those better days, or at least the end of them, and so it downplays the used universe aesthetic, especially on Naboo. The Naboo's starships are as sleek and shiny as they could be without looking too out of place in Star Wars, deliberately designed to contrast with the X-Wings and TIE Fighters of the original trilogy, and many of the locations appear smoother, cleaner, and much less worn out. Naboo is a beautiful example of this, and so is Coruscant, the heart of the Republic, which we finally got to see on the big screen in Episode 1, after years of it only appearing in the expanded universe. There's still indications of history, and the used universe aesthetic isn't completely discarded by any means. Tatooine still looks as worn out as ever, and not every ship is as sleek as the Naboos. The pod races, in particular, still have that used appearance, and the Republic and Trade Federation ships strike a nice balance between the two looks, looking less fantastical than the Naboo ships while also being noticeably cleaner and less worn. The other prequels retain elements of the Phantom Menace's aesthetic, but they make the world look increasingly used the closer the story gets to the original trilogy, so Episode 1 still stands out. It isn't just the visuals that establish the world of the Phantom Menace either. The film also does an excellent job with atmosphere and bringing life to the planets it visits. There are only 3 of those in Episode 1, and of them, Tatooine is more or less exactly the same as it was in the original trilogy. It's a backwater world on the fringe of the galaxy, run down and full of a diverse assortment of the galaxy's scum and villainy. But Naboo and Coruscant are different. Naboo is a mid-rim world, off the beaten path but still well within the Republic, and it's stunningly beautiful. From the pristine streets and palaces of Theed, to the alien and eye-catching Gungan cities, to the rolling plains and foggy swamps of the backcountry. It's a kind of planet we never saw in the original trilogy. A pleasant, peaceful world, its cities clean and ornate, and its country vibrant and unspoiled. Then there's Coruscant, the capital of the Republic, a completely urbanized planet that acts as an imposing monument to the Republic's wealth and power. Pre-existing EU sources and the later prequel films show us that Coruscant has a run-down, seedy underside to it, but in The Phantom Menace, we only get to see the gleaming skyscrapers at the top. A clean, organized, and unimaginably enormous metropolis that truly feels like the heart of the galaxy. Through these 3 planets, The Phantom Menace gives us a feel for the nature of the Republic and the galaxy as a whole at the start of the prequel era. Through Coruscant, we see the core worlds of the Republic, the strongholds of wealth and power in the galaxy, which were always out of reach in the original trilogy. On Coruscant, we see how the Republic operates, and we see how this affects the galaxy through Naboo and Tatooine. Naboo is a Republic world, nowhere near the core but not very remote, and it's clearly benefited, or at least not done all that poorly, under Republic rule. Naboo is representative of your average Republic world and the peace and prosperity the Republic has brought to the galaxy, at least ostensibly. But through Tatooine, we also see that the Republic-ruled galaxy isn't perfect. Even before the Empire, there was darkness in the galaxy, and it ruled many worlds on the Republic's fringe, which were poor and run down even at the Republic's height. Tatooine shows us that, while Episode 1 is the beginning of the legend of the Skywalker saga, it isn't the beginning of the galaxy's history. The universe is still a used one, and parts of it are even as run down as the galaxy was under the Empire. Tatooine shows us that the Empire was not the beginning of injustice in the galaxy. If anything, it was the product of it. All of this world building is conveyed almost entirely through the visuals and the atmosphere, and it paints a rich picture of what the Star Wars galaxy is like in broad strokes. There's a lot of exposition in The Phantom Menace, don't get us wrong, but there's still a lot of world building the movie does without it. If you're watching the saga in chronological order, the objectively superior viewing order, then The Phantom Menace does a great job of grounding you in the Star Wars universe, building up the backstory so that the rest of the prequels and the originals don't have to. In this way, Episode 1 is a fantastic introduction to the world of Star Wars. It's a world-building movie and it excels in that regard. Of course, it takes more to tell a story than world-building, and The Phantom Menace does have a story to tell. To the displeasure of many viewers though, it's a story that starts off being about trade negotiations. As the film's title crawl tells us, the Trade Federation, a powerful megacorporation, is upset over the Republic Senate taxing its trade routes, and it's established a blockade of Naboo in protest. The first few scenes of the movie detail a pair of Jedi being sent to negotiate an end to the blockade with Trade Federation leadership. It's not exactly the most gripping premise, but it's also not really supposed to be. The details of the dispute aren't the point. The point is to show the audience the nature of the struggles the Republic is going to face for the next 3 movies. This first bit of background tells us 2 things. First, that corporations like the Trade Federation are powerful enough to blockade planets, and second, that the Republic is unable to properly do anything about it. That second point kind of hangs in the background for most of the film, repeatedly reinforced before we get to Coruscant and see the problem in its entirety. What the audience is meant to take away is that the Republic is dysfunctional, and the first point tells us why. Because the power of the Trade Federation and corporations like it have been allowed to grow unchecked. There's another aspect of this whole thing, as we're quickly shown. The leaders of the Trade Federation, Viceroy Newt Gunray, his Lieutenant Rune Harko, and Fleet Captain Dulce Dauphine are acting on the orders of someone else, a shadowy, cloaked figure they address as Lord Sidious. The Neimoidians are cowards, and the Trade Federation's actions at Naboo are considered unusual by the Jedi. Gunray and Harko are hesitant about what they're doing, and Dulce Dauphine balks at going up against the Jedi at all, to Sidious's displeasure. The Federation is just a pawn of darker powers. All this goes to show that the Republic's decline is not an accident, and as we later learn, the events of the Phantom Menace serve a greater plan. As we're soon shown, this plan involves an outright invasion and occupation of Naboo. The attack is swift, overwhelming, and successful as the Naboo put up little resistance. Naboo is a peaceful planet, and these sorts of invasions are unheard of in the Republic. The Trade Federation's aggression is not just uncharacteristic, but something the Republic is apparently unprepared for, something highlighted more in Attack of the Clones. Thus, Naboo falls and its people are subjected to the usual cruelties of occupation. They're put into camps where they're presumably not treated well. This cruelty, and the invasion as a whole, initially doesn't seem to have much of a point beyond establishing the heartlessness of the Trade Federation, but its purpose becomes apparent much later on. Nonetheless, that the Trade Federation is in a position to be able to do these sorts of things in the first place is an issue that the film highlights from the beginning. Corporations being so powerful that they can amass private armies and invade planets in protest of government policy is not exactly a sign of a healthy society, and it's the first sign we're shown of the fatal flaws of the Republic. The first, but certainly not the last. All told, the message of this first part of The Phantom Menace is clear, simple, and important. In spite of its appearances, the golden age of the Republic has a dark side to it. Fortunately for the Naboo, Episode 1 also gives us a light in the darkness in the form of Jedi Knights. The original trilogy hypes up the Jedi as these semi-mythical, mostly long-dead heroes whose time has passed. But The Phantom Menace shows us the Jedi in their prime, and it's thrilling to watch. Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi we follow for most of the film, largely act the part of mythical heroes the Jedi were described to be in the original trilogy. They speak and act with authority and wisdom, working as a team with close to perfect coordination. They have commanding presences, and when it's time for a fight, the audience is treated to a dazzling display of acrobatics, fast-paced lightsaber choreography, and the full power of the Force. These Jedi don't need to hide or be subtle like those in the Age of the Empire. They have the authority of the Republic backing them, the power of the Force at their command, and an almost ethereal calm that makes them seem all the more like beings of myth. The Phantom Menace adds plenty of nuance to its depiction of the Jedi later on, but through Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, we at least get to see the idealized version of the Jedi the original trilogy tells us about in the flesh, and it's a joy to watch. In the first hour or so of The Phantom Menace, even as it becomes apparent that the Republic isn't as great as we might have been led to believe, we're shown that the Jedi are at least one thing it has going for it. While the Republic's total failure to rein in the Trade Federation leads to a tragedy for Naboo, the Jedi can help, and even just 2 Jedi are a problem for the Trade Federation. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan cut through the Federation's battle droids like butter and outwit them at every turn, and Newt Gunray and his cronies are clearly terrified of them. Even Darth Sidious seems a little perturbed at the idea of Jedi getting involved with the blockade of Naboo, fearing that they could ruin everything. He orders Gunray to kill them immediately, but the Jedi are able to escape both a gas attack and a squad of battle droids, and it's only thanks to the timely arrival of a pair of droidicas that the Jedi aren't able to break into the Suck-Ux Bridge and apprehend Trade Federation leadership. Even then, the Jedi are able to escape and make it to Naboo's surface, rescue Queen Amidala from Gunray's battle droids, and steal a ship to escape Naboo with. The Jedi aren't omnipotent by any stretch, but the Trade Federation is still utterly powerless to stop them. This dynamic is a reversal of the original trilogies. In the original trilogy, the heroes were rebels, always outmatched and on the run. In The Phantom Menace, even when the Jedi are outnumbered by the forces of the Trade Federation, they don't ever seem outmatched. Episode 1 makes clear that the prequel era is an age where good still has a fair bit of power in the galaxy. To shamelessly steal a line from the novelization of an entirely different prequel, though this is the end of the Age of Heroes, it has saved its best for last. And the Jedi aren't the only heroes, of course. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan first recruit the Gungan Jar Jar Binks in the swamps of Naboo, and in Theed, they're joined by Queen Amidala and her handmaidens, Captain Panaka and the Naboo Royal Guard, and the crew of the Queen's personal ship, most notably pilot Rick Oli and an astromech by the name of R2-D2. The Jedi organize these people, give them hope, and lead them in escaping Naboo against all odds. Episode 1 shows us that not only are the Jedi the heroes of this age, but that their example can make heroes out of anyone, from soldiers to hapless Gungans. Speaking of our heroes, let's talk about Episode 1's characters. Most of the characters we're introduced to in The Phantom Menace are new. Some, like Queen Amidala, Jar Jar, and Newt Gunray, go on to be recurring characters in the other prequels, while others only appear in Episode 1. But The Phantom Menace also reintroduces several characters from the original trilogy, most notably Obi-Wan Kenobi, R2-D2, C-3PO, Yoda, Palpatine, and, of course, Anakin Skywalker. And the way it deals with these characters is worth spending time on. There's a few writing pitfalls that prequel stories tend to fall into, the most damaging of which are packing in unnecessary fan-servicey explanations of things from the original material that we really didn't need, devoting large parts of the story to tying up loose ends from the original material, and worst of all, treating recurring characters just as younger versions of their original selves, giving them no room to develop or exist in their own right, outside of becoming the people we see in the original material. The prequels as a whole do a pretty good job of avoiding these pitfalls for the most part, but The Phantom Menace does it especially well. Compare it to Solo, which falls hard into all 3 pitfalls at points, and you'll see what we mean. Episode 1 stands on its own, and while there are elements of fan service and nods to the original trilogy all throughout, they're neither excessive nor intrusive, and very little feels like it was forced in for the sake of older material. This is especially apparent in the returning characters, all of whom are allowed to be characters in their own right in The Phantom Menace, not just extensions of who they were in the original trilogy. Some of them can even feel like different characters at times, people who clearly changed a lot in the 30 years between Episode 1 and Episode 4, which makes their characters feel more real and alive. At the same time, with the exception of Anakin, who we'll get to in a moment, there's still clear continuity between the different versions of these characters. The Obi-Wan Kenobi of The Phantom Menace is a much different man than the Obi-Wan Kenobi of A New Hope, but he's still fundamentally Obi-Wan Kenobi, just at a much different stage of his life. Obi-Wan is really the best example of this. In The Phantom Menace, we see him as a Padawan, much younger and more headstrong than the wise old Jedi Master we saw in the original trilogy. He doesn't have the experience or the wisdom of old Ben just yet, and throughout the film, he's repeatedly reprimanded by Qui-Gon for his hastiness and occasional rash judgment. He maintains Jedi calm throughout most of the film, but he also argues with Qui-Gon, teases Jar Jar, and generally acts, well, younger than we're used to from the original trilogy. Obi-Wan is his own character who will get his own character arc over the course of the prequel trilogy, eventually developing from a headstrong Padawan to a wise Jedi Master. At the same time though, there's never a point where Obi-Wan's portrayal in The Phantom Menace feels uncharacteristic. He's unmistakably Obi-Wan Kenobi the whole way through. Palpatine takes this even further. Both as Senator Palpatine and as Darth Sidious, you can see elements of the Emperor through his portrayal in The Phantom Menace, but both versions of the character have major differences. Darth Sidious is a lot more subtle than the Emperor. He works from the shadows, appearing mostly via hologram and sending others to carry out his bidding. Sidious is a manipulator, intimidating but not overbearing, seemingly all-knowing but rarely present in the flesh, whereas the Emperor was much more overt, aggressive, and vainglorious. Sidious still clearly resembles the Empire, if with a more human-looking face. They dress the same and they both exude darkness. And while his methods are different, Sidious's nature is the same. He's still pure evil, the embodiment of the dark side. Naturally, that means he's a politician at his day job. In contrast to Sidious, Senator Palpatine seems to have nothing in common with Emperor Palpatine. He carries himself as a kindly old man, a grandfather figure, politically cunning but generally harmless. It's only when you meet him up close on Coruscant that you can start to see his true nature, or at least the echo of it. Everything about his characterization is a facade, and if you know who Palpatine really is and you're examining his character closely, you can see it. He acts as if he's wearing a mask at all times because, of course, he is. Yoda, R2-D2, and C-3PO, meanwhile, are all very similar characters to their original trilogy depictions. Yoda is still the wise old Jedi Master, as he's presumably been for hundreds of years, while R2 and 3PO are R2 and 3PO. But they all avoid feeling out of place through slight differences in character and big differences in status. Yoda is less eccentric and much more serious in The Phantom Menace, and instead of living in exile in the back end of nowhere, we find him ruling the Jedi Order from a temple on Coruscant, surrounded by other wise Jedi Masters. His environment is different, and it makes his character feel different too. He comes off as more of a wizened master than a crazy old frog living in a swamp, even if his character isn't actually all that different. R2 and 3PO, meanwhile, have only just recently been built in The Phantom Menace. 3PO isn't even complete yet, while R2 looks like he's just came off the factory floor. Their personalities are no different, but in the original trilogy, they essentially form a two-part character, so having them mostly separate through The Phantom Menace makes them feel more different than they really are. Episode 1 does really well with its characters across the board. Not only are the recurring characters well written and acted, but most of the new characters are great too, particularly Qui-Gon and Darth Maul. This is generally taken as a given by fans, but when the film came out, one of the movie's most developed and well-written characters was a bit more controversial. Unlike the other returning characters from the original trilogy, Anakin Skywalker is absolutely nothing like Darth Vader. In The Phantom Menace, Anakin is just 9 years old, and there isn't really any hints of who he'll grow up to be outside of subtle musical cues and promotional material. This was one of the most lambasted parts of The Phantom Menace when it released. People came into the movie expecting to see a proto-Darth Vader, and instead they got to see him as a cheerful, goofy kid. Many found it jarring, and the more melodramatic called it. Even looking back at the prequel trilogy retrospectively, Plenty of people will say that Anakin should have been introduced as an older teenager, like Luke was. We disagree. Within the scope of the prequels and the story of Anakin Skywalker, it's actually very important that we start off with Anakin as a young kid, long before any hint of Vader has surfaced, precisely because of how sharply it contrasts with who Anakin becomes. Anakin's story is, in part, a cautionary tale about how anyone can become a monster, and having Anakin as a young child in Episode 1 makes this message hit home a lot more than it would if he started out older. Because whether we admit it or not, we were all like that once, and if little Annie could grow up to be Darth Vader, then so can we. It also serves to highlight that evil isn't some inherent trait. While Anakin displays clear warning signs of the dark side in the later prequels, this isn't the case in The Phantom Menace. He's just an ordinary kid, and only the Jedi Council senses a trace of danger in him. Even this small hint, Anakin's fear, is pretty ordinary, something everyone experiences. The Phantom Menace shows us that there was nothing inherently evil about Anakin Skywalker that made him fall to the dark side. It was the choices he made that transformed him from an innocent kid into the face of evil itself. The extent of Anakin's innocence in The Phantom Menace, which largely just boils down to him being an ordinary goofy kid, emphasizes this point. The Phantom Menace also doesn't treat Anakin Skywalker as just a young Darth Vader. Anakin is a character in his own right, and The Phantom Menace spends a fair bit of runtime establishing who he is and what he's like. After all, Episode 1 is meant to be the beginning of his story. It only makes sense for him to give a complete introduction. Over the course of The Phantom Menace, Anakin Skywalker is established as bold, snarky, and even a bit of a daredevil, if also empathetic and sensitive. He's a gifted mechanic and pilot, and he participates in a dangerous sport that humans are usually incapable of even surviving. The Force is clearly strong with him, such that Qui-Gon even believes he's the chosen one of the Jedi prophecy. He's also a slave. For all of his talents, Anakin Skywalker lives in the most dire of circumstances, not even legally considered a person. He's the fully owned servant of a greedy businessman on the back end of nowhere, far from Coruscant, the Republic, and the Jedi. He would be far from the only one, both in Star Wars and real life, to have his talents squandered by the circumstances of his birth. But in The Phantom Menace, we see Anakin become one of the rare few who's able to escape such conditions. He's rescued by Qui-Gon in the end and taken to Coruscant to become a Jedi. His mother, Shmi, however, is left behind. That Anakin starts in such a low place highlights that anyone can make an impact, for good or ill, on the world. But unlike many stories that are built around such narratives, Episode 1 makes clear that this can only happen when people are given the right opportunities. It's only through pure luck, or rather will of the Force, that Anakin is freed from slavery and given a chance in life. Most people in his condition, his mother among them, aren't so lucky. Whatever talents they have amount to nothing, as societal circumstances beyond their control keep them trapped for life. This is an interesting and often overlooked message, because while it establishes that individual people can be heroes and make a difference in the world, a theme present throughout the original trilogy, it also claps back at this theme a little, establishing that people don't get an opportunity to make a difference if the societal conditions of the world don't allow for it. The world of Star Wars is not just driven by individual heroes, but by broader social systems as well, and the social ills that societies create and tolerate constrain individuals' abilities to make a difference. Anakin's initial status as a slave also provides him with a big load of pre-packaged trauma for him to build on over the course of the prequel trilogy. In this, we can retrospectively see the seeds of Anakin's path to the dark side. As we discussed in our analysis of Anakin's character, the trauma of slavery is the source of his attachment issues, which we see the earliest hints of in The Phantom Menace, when Anakin struggles with leaving his mother. That's obviously nothing out of the ordinary for a 9-year-old kid, but as the later prequels show, it's the start of much more dangerous forms of attachment that lead Anakin down a dark road. As Yoda says, what starts as fear can become anger and then hate, and in the end, suffering. But as far as the Phantom Menace is concerned, all of that is still years off. In this film, Qui-Gon and company help Anakin enter the Boonta Eve Classic, a pod race that Anakin wins, winning his freedom in the process thanks to a wager placed by Qui-Gon. Now free, he's able to leave Tatooine with the Jedi, and after a brief skirmish between Qui-Gon and Darth Maul, our heroes finally travel to Coruscant, where the true nature of everything that's been going on in the Phantom Menace so far is laid out. While at first glance, Coruscant seems majestic and awe-inspiring, Episode 1 quickly shows us that its gleaming exterior belies how thoroughly rotten the planet, and thus the Republic, has become. Throughout the Phantom Menace, we're shown evidence of the increasing dysfunction of the Republic, from the Trade Federation's unchecked power, to the Senate's gridlock on the issue, to how worlds like Tatooine have been left at the mercy of the Hutts. But when Queen Amidala goes with Senator Palpatine to request Republic intervention on Naboo from the Senate, we see the utter dysfunction of the Republic for ourselves. Palpatine and Amidala make their plea to the Senate, but Lot Dodd, the senator for the Trade Federation, protests that they have no proof, and the Senate is gridlocked. Valorum, who Palpatine tells us has had his hands tied by the Senate thanks to baseless allegations of corruption, is utterly ineffective, and can only promise to conduct an investigation of the situation despite the urgency of the events on Naboo. This scene, boring though some might find it, is vitally important to the whole Star Wars saga. The Phantom Menace shows us all throughout that the Republic is quietly failing. This scene shows us why. The Republic's problems stem from the fact that its democracy is in decline. The Senate no longer represents the interests of the people of the Republic. Instead, it serves the will of corrupt politicians and powerful corporations. The Trade Federation is even shown to have Senate representation, which is a not-so-subtle way of saying that the Republic has started to represent the interests of wealthy corporations more than ordinary people, which is to say that it's ceasing to be genuinely democratic. The result is gridlock, dysfunction, and corruption. The Republic has effectively ceased to work. And to quote George Lucas, there's an interesting thing about democracy, which is that if you don't treat it well, if you don't do your job, especially if you're a representative in the Senate or the Parliament or whatever, then the whole thing can go awry, because if you're always bickering and not agreeing on things and doing the people's work who elected you, a tyrant will come in, take over, and do it for you, because the people want to get the job done. We see this phenomenon begin in the Phantom Menace as Queen Amidala, frustrated at the ineffectiveness of the Senate, calls for a vote of no confidence in Supreme Chancellor Valorum. Valorum is ousted, and Senator Palpatine enters the running to replace him. He's ultimately successful, but we'll talk more about that later, because despite Amidala's best efforts, even with Valorum removed, the Senate is still no help. In the end, she's forced to take matters into her own hands, to return to Naboo and take the fight to the Trade Federation. Convinced that the powers that be won't resolve the situation, Amidala rallies her own people, makes peace with the Gungans through gestures of transparency and humility, and in the end, she leads the Naboo to victory against their conquerors. In the absence of democracy, Queen Amidala resorts to revolution, and the strength of the people working together defeats the Trade Federation. It's the same sort of phenomenon as plays out in the original trilogy, just on the scale of one planet, and it connects the pro-revolutionary themes of the original trilogy to the decline of democracy in the prequels, positioning the former as a direct response to the latter. In the process, the Phantom Menace gives us a truncated version of part of the message of the whole Star Wars saga, priming us to understand the message when it's presented in full through the later films. While Amidala is busy trying and failing to get the Senate to be useful, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan return to the Jedi Temple, taking Anakin with them. It's at this point that the Phantom Menace tears up that idealized version of the Jedi we talked about earlier and shows us the reality. The Jedi Order isn't anywhere near as far gone as the Republic as a whole, but it's bureaucratic, thoroughly enmeshed with the Republic, and the Jedi Council seems just as hesitant to make decisions as the Senate is. Episode 1 doesn't really show us any serious flaws in the Order, unlike the later prequels, but it nonetheless makes clear that the Jedi are imperfect and that their Order is ultimately just another illusion, prone to the same problems as any other. The Jedi Council scenes recontextualize Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's role in the earlier parts of the film. They're still heroes that live up to the Jedi myth, but they're shown to be exceptions in that regard. Qui-Gon is even said to be at odds with the Council. Obi-Wan claims that his disagreements with them are so frequent that they're all that's kept Qui-Gon from being on the Council himself. We get to see a few of these disagreements firsthand, as the Council forbids Qui-Gon from training Anakin, believing the boy to be dangerous and too old for training. And they also doubt Qui-Gon's claim that the Sith had returned when he tells the story of his encounter with Darth Maul. Neither of these are necessarily bad calls on the Council's behalf. They're absolutely correct about Anakin being dangerous, after all, and while it's fair for them to doubt that the Sith have returned after 1,000 years of absence, they ultimately give Qui-Gon the benefit of the doubt, allowing him to investigate the matter further. Nonetheless, the Council is put in opposition to Qui-Gon, and this conveys to the viewer that there's a conflict within the Jedi Order, a disconnect between the heroes of the Order and the masters who run the show. Most of this is set up for the later prequel films, which dive much deeper into the issues with the Jedi Order, but within the scope of the Phantom Menace, it makes clear that the Jedi Knights aren't the perfect beings of legends, and that, to an extent, the decay of the Republic has affected them as well. As the Jedi Order declines, the Sith Lords rise. The Jedi believe them long extinct, but they've survived in the shadows for centuries, and as we learn at the end of the film, they've done so by following the rule of two, limiting their order to just 2 members at a time. These two, the Master and the Apprentice, have worked in the shadows for untold generations, their subtle manipulation worsening the corruption and decay of the Republic. They've been playing a long game, and in the Phantom Menace, we see it start to come to fruition. All throughout Episode 1, Darth Sidious manipulates events from the shadows, giving the Trade Federation its orders and, as Senator Palpatine, manipulating Queen Amidala and the Senate into giving him power. But early in the film, we're introduced to another Sith, Darth Maul, Sidious's apprentice. Maul, as with the other antagonists of his caliber in the prequels, represents an aspect of Darth Vader. He's the obedient apprentice, an imposing, deadly efficient killer. As with the other prequel antagonists, he takes these character traits further than Vader does. While Vader's obedience has its limits, Maul is an instrument of his master, a weapon pointed at the heart of the Jedi. He barely speaks, he never expresses any thoughts or emotions of his own, and he works quickly, efficiently, and silently. In the Phantom Menace, Darth Maul is a manifestation of his master's will, an assassin completely devoted to his task and nothing more. He's a simple character, but a very effective one, and he shows the audience that the Lords of the Sith are not to be trifled with. Thanks to his own pride and overconfidence, Maul is defeated in the end by Obi-Wan, but not before he kills Qui-Gon Jinn. This is devastating both for Obi-Wan and the audience, and it's a hint of what's to come in the later prequels. Qui-Gon represented the ideal Jedi Knight, and now the Sith have struck him down. But for Anakin, there's a silver lining in Qui-Gon's death. With his dying words, Qui-Gon makes Obi-Wan promise to train Anakin. Obi-Wan, now a Jedi Knight, is dead set on fulfilling this promise, and between this and Anakin's performance in the Battle of Naboo, in which he destroys the droid control ship and saves the day, the Council begrudgingly allows Anakin to be trained. Even as he dies, Qui-Gon gets what he wants. Against the better judgment of the Jedi Masters, Anakin Skywalker will become a Jedi, to the eventual misfortune of all. The Phantom Menace ultimately ends on a happy note, the only prequel to do so. Darth Maul is defeated, and the Battle of Naboo is won. The droid army is deactivated, and the leaders of the Trade Federation are sent off to stand trial for their crimes. The Naboo and Gungans have made peace, things seem to be looking up for the Republic, and Anakin has become a Jedi Padawan. Only the death of Qui-Gon and the fact that Darth Sidious is still at large put a damper on things, but the movie brushes these things aside for its final scene, a victory parade attended by our heroes and newly appointed Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. Of course, as the later prequels reveal, this is a false victory. The music in that final scene hints at why. The track is a sped up, upbeat remix of the Emperor's theme from Return of the Jedi. Everything has proceeded exactly as Darth Sidious intended. We mentioned earlier that, initially, it's unclear what the Trade Federation even hoped to accomplish with this invasion of Naboo and its openly cruel treatment of its people. But if you pay attention, and especially if you have the context of the other prequels, it becomes apparent that the cruelty was the point. The Trade Federation's actions were meant to provoke a wave of sympathy for Naboo that its senator could ride to the Supreme Chancellery. With everyone else distracted, a Sith Lord has assumed rule of the Republic. The plots of The Phantom Menace is often criticized for not being very transparent. You have to either pay close attention or have the context of the other prequels to figure out what the main narrative of the movie actually is. The film bounces from plotline to plotline, never pointing out what the viewer is supposed to be focused on, and the result is that many viewers only truly understand the plot of the movie on later viewings. But rather than this actually being a flaw of the movie, it's what makes its plot so brilliant. From beginning to end, it distracts us from what's really going on, throwing us into diversion after diversion, because that's exactly how tyrants seize power. While the public's attention is fixed on wars and meaningless debates, nobody notices as the true threat, the Phantom Menace, becomes increasingly powerful. It's only in retrospect that most people understand what's truly going on in the early stages of a tyrant's rise. At the end of the day, Episode 1 is about the Phantom Menace, the rising threat that nobody sees, which isn't just the growing power of the Sith, but the decline of democracy and the growth of unchecked corporate power that the Sith take advantage of to seize power. The Phantom Menace is not just Darth Sidious, but all the little cracks starting to form in the Republic, eroding democracy and paving the way for an empire which not even the Jedi see until it's too late. It's Darth Sidious and also the Trade Federation, the Senate as a whole, and a young boy with fear in his heart and darkness in his future, soon to be trained in the ways of the Force. In Episode 1, the saga begins. A saga of the death of democracy, the rise of a tyrant, and a tormented young man's path to the dark side. There are warning signs of all present throughout the film, and they're all ignored, paving the way for what's to come. The Phantom Menace, like all of the original 6 Star Wars films, has a message for its audience. It warns us to pay attention to see the signs of democratic decline while they're still in the early stages, and to act to stop them. It's a message the film conveys skillfully and with a great deal more subtlety than it's given credit for. The Phantom Menace is not a perfect movie, but it's ultimately nowhere near as bad as it was and sometimes still is made out to be. In spite of its flaws, it succeeds at most of what it attempts, delivering mostly well-written characters, clever and layered plot, beautiful visuals and music, and some of the best world building in the Star Wars saga. It's fun, it's meaningful, it's heavily underrated, and we hope you've enjoyed our look back at it. But what do you think? Has your perspective on the Phantom Menace changed since your first viewing? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.